In the autumn of 1945, a defeated German general sat across from his American interrogators in a bare room at a prisoner of war facility. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl had once been Hitler's chief of military operations, the man who planned campaigns that conquered most of Europe, the officer who signed Germany's unconditional surrender just 5 months earlier. Now he was answering questions about the war, about what went wrong, about the Allied commanders who had crushed the Wehrmacht. When the interrogators asked about General George Patton, Jodl paused. Then he offered an assessment that would have seemed impossible just 4 years earlier. He was the American Guderian, Jodl said. He was very bold and preferred large movements. He took big risks and won big successes. The comparison was extraordinary. Heinz Guderian was Germany's father of armoured warfare, the architect of Blitzkrieg, the general whose panzers had conquered Poland in 3 weeks and France in 6. His book, Achtung Panzer, had become the Bible of tank warfare. To compare any Allied commander to Guderian was the highest compliment a German officer could pay, and Jodl was not alone. Across occupied Germany, in interrogation rooms and prison camps, defeated Wehrmacht generals were offering similar assessments of a man they had fought against, feared, and ultimately been crushed by. But here is what makes this story remarkable. During the war itself, the Germans had barely noticed Patton at all. The same generals who praised him so effusively after the surrender had paid him almost no attention while the fighting raged. This is the story of how one American general went from being virtually unknown to his enemies to being considered their most dangerous opponent, and what that transformation reveals about the nature of military reputation, the fog of war, and the difference between how we fight our enemies and how we remember them. George Smith Patton Jr. was born on November 11, 1885 in San Gabriel, California, into a family that considered military service a sacred calling. His grandfather had been a Confederate colonel killed at the Battle of Cedar Creek. His great-uncle had died at Gettysburg. From childhood, Patton was raised on stories of martial glory and trained to believe that his destiny lay on the battlefield. He grew up reading military history obsessively, particularly accounts of ancient warfare and cavalry tactics, convinced that he had lived previous lives as a warrior. He entered the Virginia Military Institute in 1903 before transferring to West Point, where he graduated in 1909. He competed in the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, placing 5th in the modern pentathlon, an event designed to test the skills of a military courier: running, swimming, fencing, shooting, and riding. He studied fencing in France and became the army's first master of the sword. He redesigned the cavalry saber used by American forces. Everything in his early career pointed toward a man preparing himself for war with an intensity that bordered on obsession. When the United States entered the First World War, Patton found his calling. On November 10, 1917, he became the first officer assigned to the new Tank Corps, a branch of warfare so novel that the Army had no doctrine, no training manuals, and almost no tanks. Patton built the American tank program from nothing. When the first 10 tanks arrived at the training center in Bourg, France on March 23, 1918, Patton personally backed them off the railcars because he was the only American soldier who knew how to drive them. He wrote the training manuals himself. He established the tactics through trial and error. At the Battle of Saint-Mihiel in September 1918, Patton led his tanks into combat, walking in front of his vehicles through German fire because he believed officers should lead from the front. He entered German-held villages ahead of his own forces, pistol in hand, an act of personal courage that would have seemed reckless from any other officer. 2 weeks later, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive on September 26, A German machine gun bullet tore through his left thigh near the village of Chepi. He lay in a shell crater for 2 hours, continuing to direct operations while bleeding profusely. Private First Class Joe Angelo crawled to his position under fire, bandaged the wound and dragged him to safety. Angelo received the Distinguished Service Cross. Patton received the Distinguished Service Cross as well, along with a profound conviction that he was destined for military greatness. The war ended before Patton could return to combat. He spent the interwar years studying armoured warfare, reading everything the Germans published about tank tactics, and waiting impatiently for the next conflict. He corresponded with other tank enthusiasts. He experimented with new formations. He wrote papers arguing that the next war would be won by massed armour striking deep into enemy territory. When World War II began, he was 54 years old and still a colonel. Many considered him too old, too volatile, and too difficult to ever hold high command. They were wrong. Patton's rise during World War II was rapid and controversial. By November 1942, he commanded American forces landing in North Africa as part of Operation Torch. By March 1943, after the disaster at Kasserine Pass had humiliated American arms, he took command of Second Corps and transformed it through sheer force of will. He imposed harsh discipline. He demanded proper uniforms, polished brass, and correct military courtesy even in combat zones. He drove his men relentlessly, and they began to win. By July 1943, Patton had risen to command the 7th Army during the invasion of Sicily. The campaign showcased both his brilliance and his recklessness. The original plan assigned his army a supporting role, protecting the flank of General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army, while Montgomery drove northeast toward the strategic prize of Messina. Patton chafed at the subordinate role. He believed the plan wasted American capabilities, and he was determined to change it. When the opportunity arose, Patton improvised. He sent his forces on a sweeping end run around the western coast of the island, driving through mountainous terrain the planners had considered impassable. Major General Lucien Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division covered 100 miles in 72 hours, a pace that exhausted men and machines but shattered German expectations. By July 22, Patton had captured Palermo, the largest city in western Sicily. Then he turned east, racing Montgomery to Messina. The race became personal. Patton and Montgomery had clashed since their first meeting in North Africa, their rivalry fueled by national pride, personal ambition, and incompatible personalities. Montgomery was methodical, cautious, and supremely confident in his own abilities. Patton was aggressive, theatrical, and equally convinced of his genius. Both men wanted Messina, and both drove their armies hard to get there. On August 17, 1943, at approximately 10 in the morning, Patton's forces entered Messina hours before the British arrived. When British Brigadier J.C. Curry appeared later that day, he graciously acknowledged the outcome. "General, it was a jolly good race," Curry said. "I congratulate you." Patton had won, but at the very moment of his triumph, he committed the errors that would nearly destroy his career. The slapping incidents occurred during evacuation hospital visits on August 3rd and August 10th. On both occasions, Patton encountered soldiers who showed no visible wounds. These men were suffering from combat fatigue, a condition we now understand as a genuine psychological injury caused by the trauma of prolonged combat. Patton, raised on 19th century ideals of martial courage, saw only cowardice. The first incident involved Private Charles Cool, a 27-year-old soldier from Indiana serving with the 1st Infantry Division. Cool had been diagnosed with psychoneurosis anxiety state, moderately severe, and was also running a fever of 102.2 degrees from malaria. Patton called him a coward, slapped him across the face with his gloves, and ordered him back to the front. The second incident, 1 week later, was worse. Private Paul Bennett was a 21-year-old artillery soldier, a 4-year army veteran who had begged not to be evacuated because he wanted to stay with his unit. Bennett was suffering from severe shell shock after a friend had been wounded beside him. Patton slapped Bennett twice, once across the face and once on the back of the head, with such force that Bennett's helmet liner flew off. Patton drew his pistol and threatened to shoot the young soldier for cowardice. The incidents might have remained secret, buried in official reports. 3 journalists who learned what happened agreed to suppress the story at General Eisenhower's request, but the secret could not hold forever. On November 21, 1943, radio commentator Drew Pearson broadcast the story to the American public during his evening program. The scandal exploded. Hundreds of thousands of letters demanding Patton's dismissal flooded the War Department. Congressmen called for his court-martial. His career appeared finished. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, faced an impossible choice. Patton was undeniably talented, perhaps the most aggressive armored commander the Americans possessed. Eisenhower himself wrote that Patton was indispensable to the war effort, one of the guarantors of our victory. But he had assaulted enlisted men, and the American public was furious. Eisenhower chose to save Patton, forcing him to apologize publicly to the soldiers, to the medical staff who had witnessed the incidents, and to every division in his command. For 11 months, from August 1943 to July 1944, Patton sat in disgrace. His 7th Army was disbanded. Its soldiers were distributed to other commands. Command of the American ground forces for the coming invasion of France went to Omar Bradley, a general who had once served under Patton as a corps commander. The most aggressive general in the American army would not lead the assault on Fortress Europe, but Eisenhower found another use for his disgraced commander. The Allies were planning an elaborate deception operation called Fortitude, designed to convince the Germans that the real invasion would target the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. They needed a commander prominent enough that the Germans would believe he led the main invasion force. They chose Patton. For months, Patton commanded the 1st United States Army Group, a phantom formation of inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, plywood aircraft, and non-existent divisions spread across southeastern England. The deception was elaborate and multifaceted, involving double agents, controlled leaks, and carefully staged movements designed to be spotted by German reconnaissance. The Germans, who monitored Allied communications and analyzed intelligence reports, concluded that the most dangerous American general would surely lead the decisive blow. When the Normandy invasion came on June 6, 1944, Hitler and his generals remained convinced it was merely a diversion. The real attack, led by Patton, would come at Calais. This belief paralyzed German decision-making during the crucial first weeks of the campaign. 19 divisions of the German 15th Army, nearly 150,000 men, remained at Pas-de-Calais for almost 7 weeks after D-Day, waiting for an invasion that never came. This is where the mythology of German fear becomes complicated. Historians have long claimed that the Germans chose to believe Patton commanded the main invasion force because they feared and respected him above all other Allied commanders. The story makes intuitive sense. It flatters American pride and suggests that Patton's reputation preceded him across the lines. But when historian Harry Yeide examined German wartime records for his 2011 book, Fighting Patton, he found a different story. The Germans had reached their conclusions about the invasion location before they even identified Patton as the Phantom Army's commander. German intelligence analysts concluded that Calais was the logical target based on geography, logistics, and strategic considerations, particularly the shorter distance across the Channel and the more direct route to the industrial Ruhr region. Patton's assignment was incidental to decisions already made. More striking still, German intelligence records show remarkably little interest in Patton during the war itself. The first German mention of his name came in a mid-May 1943 report noting simply that he had taken command of Second Corps, a position he had already left weeks earlier. The report described him merely as an energetic and responsibility-loving command personality, hardly the assessment of a feared opponent. A February 1944 German Air War Academy document profiled every senior Allied general expected to participate in the invasion, discussing their backgrounds, capabilities, and command styles. Patton, alone among the senior American commanders, was not included. This is the paradox at the heart of our story. The generals who would later call Patton the American Guderian had barely noticed him while he was still fighting. The fear and respect came later, after the war was lost, when defeated men looked back at who had beaten them and tried to make sense of their catastrophe. What changed everything was what happened after August 1st, 1944, when Patton finally returned to combat command. The 3rd United States Army became operational at noon that day, and Patton unleashed it like a weapon he had been sharpening for his entire life. The breakout from Normandy had begun days earlier with Operation Cobra, a massive aerial bombardment that shattered German defensive lines west of St. Lo. 1,500 heavy bombers dropped over 3,000 tons of explosives on German positions, followed by nearly 1,000 medium bombers, adding more destruction. The bombardment was so intense that it killed 111 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American killed in the European theater, when bombs fell short of their targets. American forces poured through the gap, but it was Patton who transformed tactical success into strategic catastrophe for the Germans. In the first 2 weeks of August, his Third Army advanced over 400 miles, covering distances that German generals would later describe as unprecedented in modern warfare. His tanks moved so fast that retreating German units found themselves surrounded before they knew they were in danger. The numbers tell the story. Third Army captured Avranches on August 1st, the day Patton assumed command. By August 4th, his forces had wheeled west into Brittany, south toward the Loire, and east toward Paris simultaneously, attacking in 3 directions at once. 70,000 troops and their vehicles crossed the Pontebeau Bridge, a single vital choke point, in less than 3 days. German commanders, watching the situation maps, saw an army that seemed to be everywhere at once, attacking in directions that defied conventional military logic. The Falaise pocket battle in mid-August demonstrated both Patton's brilliance and the frustrations of coalition warfare. His forces drove north toward Argentan, covering 35 miles in a single day on August 13th, positioning themselves to link up with British and Canadian forces driving south from Falaise. The junction would have trapped the remnants of 2 German armies in a pocket from which few could escape, but General Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, ordered him to halt at Argentan, 17 kilometers short of closing the trap. The reasons remain debated to this day, involving concerns about friendly fire, worries about German counterattacks, and uncertainty about coordination with Montgomery's forces. The gap remained open for days, allowing an estimated 20 to 40,000 German soldiers to escape eastward before it finally closed on August 21st. Despite this frustration, the Falaise pocket was a catastrophe for Germany. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers died in the pocket. 50,000 more were captured. The roads inside the encirclement were choked with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, and abandoned equipment. General Eisenhower visited the battlefield and later wrote that it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. General Gunther Blumentritt, who served as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, later described what it was like to watch the Third Army's advance from German headquarters. We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, he said during post-war interviews with British military historian Basil Liddell-Hart. He was a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action. His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander. He even improved on Napoleon's basic principle, activité vitesse, and speed. In these same interviews, Blumentritt offered a physical demonstration comparing Patton to Montgomery. After paying tribute to the speed of Patton's drive, Liddell-Hart recorded, he added that Field Marshal Montgomery was the one general who never suffered a reverse. He moved like this. Blumentritt then took a series of very deliberate and short steps, putting his foot down heavily each time. The implication was clear. Montgomery was methodical and safe. Patton was aggressive and dangerous. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, offered his own assessment to Liddell-Hart. Montgomery and Patton were the two best that I met, Rundstedt said. Field Marshal Montgomery was very systematic. That is all right if you have sufficient forces and sufficient time. The unspoken criticism of Montgomery's caution contrasted with implicit praise for Patton's willingness to take risks. But the German assessments require careful context. These comments came during post-war interviews when Germany had surrendered, its generals were prisoners, and the mystique of the Wehrmacht had been shattered. The same commanders who praised Patton so generously had failed to stop him when it mattered. Heinz Guderian himself acknowledged Patton after the war. When asked about the American general by Allied interrogators, the father of Blitzkrieg offered a professional's assessment. I hear much about General Patton, and he conducted a good campaign, Guderian said. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place. The words carry weight precisely because of who spoke them. Guderian was not some staff officer offering opinions from behind the lines. He was the general who had commanded the panzers that cut France in half in 1940, whose 2nd Panzer Group had driven to within sight of Moscow in 1941. For him to say Patton fought as he would have fought was the equivalent of a master acknowledging a peer. The parallels between the two men were genuine and substantive. Both believed that tanks should be concentrated for maximum striking power rather than dispersed as infantry support. Both emphasized speed and deep penetration over methodical advance. Both practiced combined arms coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power. Both led from the front, taking personal risks that exposed them to enemy fire, and both had the instinctive grasp of terrain and timing that separates competent commanders from exceptional ones. Patton had studied Guderian's writings obsessively during the interwar years. He read the German's book Achtung Panzer when it was published in 1937, absorbing its arguments about the revolutionary potential of massed armoured forces. He analysed German operations in Poland and France, dissecting the campaigns that had stunned the world. When he finally got his chance to apply these lessons, he did so with a ferocity that validated years of preparation. His command philosophy matched the German concept of Auftragstaktik, what the Americans called mission-type orders. Patton told his subordinates what to accomplish but not how to accomplish it. Never tell people how to do things, he instructed his officers. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity. This approach empowered junior commanders to exploit opportunities as they arose rather than waiting for permission from headquarters. The result was an army that moved faster than German intelligence could track. Reports that placed Third Army units in one location were obsolete before they reached German headquarters. Counterattacks planned against positions Patton had held yesterday struck empty ground because he had advanced 20 miles since the reconnaissance was conducted. But the story of Patton and his German admirers is not simply a tale of unbroken triumph. The war also revealed his limitations, moments when the aggressive tactics that served him so well in pursuit became liabilities in grinding attritional combat. The Lorraine campaign, fought from September 1st to December 18th, 1944, exposed these weaknesses brutally. Patton's Third Army, which had raced across France at sometimes 40 miles per day, suddenly found itself stuck in eastern France, fighting for inches against determined German resistance in the worst weather in decades. The problems began with supply. The Allied logistics system, stretched thin by the rapid advance across France, could not deliver enough fuel to sustain Patton's momentum. His army needed 400,000 gallons of gasoline daily, but received barely half that amount. On August 31, his tanks literally ran dry near the Moselle River. Vehicles that had terrorized German defenders sat immobile for lack of fuel, while Patton raged at headquarters about supply priorities. The situation worsened when Eisenhower chose to support Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's ambitious but ultimately failed airborne assault into the Netherlands. Supplies that might have gone to Patton were diverted north. The broad front strategy that Eisenhower favored meant no single army received enough resources to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The Germans, meanwhile, stabilized their lines with fresh divisions arriving from the Reich. Hitler had ordered a massive mobilization, creating 25 new Volksgrenadier divisions to defend the homeland. The fortifications around Metz, the ancient fortress city that guarded the approach to Germany, proved almost impervious to assault. These fortifications had been built and improved over decades by both French and German engineers, creating a defensive network that had never been taken by direct assault in the city's long history. Rain began in mid-September and continued almost without pause until October 12th, turning the ground to mud and negating the mobility advantages that Patton's tactics required. Tanks that could advance 40 miles in a day on paved French roads could barely move through the mire of Lorraine. Air support, which had devastated German columns during the summer pursuit, was grounded for days at a time by low clouds and poor visibility. General Hermann Balck, commanding Army Group G against Patton from September 21 to December 24, offered a very different assessment from the effusive post-war praise of other German generals. According to German records examined by historian Harry Yeider, Balck spoke of the poor and timid leadership of the Americans during the Lorraine fighting. He and his chief of staff, Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, would study their situation maps and conclude that Patton was helping them by failing to exploit his successes. The Lorraine campaign lasted 109 days and cost the Third Army approximately 50,000 combat casualties, including over 6,000 killed and 36,000 wounded. For an advance of barely 40 to 60 miles, Patton paid a price in blood that contradicted his reputation for swift and economic warfare. A 1985 analysis by the United States Army Combat Studies Institute was even more critical, noting that Third Army required over 3 months and suffered roughly 1/3 of all the casualties it would sustain in the entire European war to capture the province of Lorraine. This is the complexity that the post-war mythology often obscures. Patton was genuinely brilliant at mobile warfare, at the slashing attacks and deep penetrations that characterized the best German operations, but when forced into attritional combat, when he had to grind through fortified positions rather than sweep around them, his methods proved costly and sometimes ineffective. Then came the Battle of the Bulge, and Patton's response became the stuff of legend. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their last great offensive in the West. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, supported by almost 2,000 tanks and assault guns, smashed into thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. American divisions that had been sent to the quiet Ardennes sector to rest and refit were overrun. Key crossroads fell to German paratroopers and armoured columns. The entire Allied position in Western Europe seemed at risk. At the centre of the German advance sat the town of Bastogne, a vital road junction where 7 major highways converged. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the road network that any advance westward required. The American 101st Airborne Division, reinforced by elements of the 10th Armoured Division, was surrounded by December 21st. The paratroopers, outnumbered and running low on ammunition, held the town against repeated German assaults. Their commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, responded to a German surrender ultimatum with a single word that entered American military legend: nuts. But the 101st could not hold forever. They needed relief, and they needed it fast. On December 19, Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting of senior commanders at Verdun. The situation was desperate. How quickly could anyone attack the German flank and relieve the besieged garrison? Patton stunned the assembled generals. He had anticipated the crisis. As early as December 12th, 4 days before the German attack, Patton had sensed something was wrong with the quiet along the German front. He ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for a turn northward into what would become the Bulge. While others were still absorbing the shock of the German offensive, Patton had already positioned his army to respond. He told Eisenhower that Third Army could attack northward into the German flank within 48 hours. The officers in the room were skeptical, and Patton felt compelled to argue his case. What he was proposing seemed logistically impossible. His army was engaged in active combat 100 miles to the south, facing east toward Germany. To attack into the Bulge, he would have to disengage 3 divisions from combat, wheel them 90 degrees, move them 150 miles over icy roads in the dead of winter, and launch a coordinated assault, all while maintaining contact with the enemy. Eisenhower suggested 3 days might be more realistic. Patton insisted on 2 days and made it happen in 3. The 4th Armoured Division, the 80th Infantry Division, and the 26th Infantry Division executed a pivot that military historians still study as a masterpiece of operational planning and logistical execution. Over 133,000 vehicles moved north through snow and ice. 63,000 tons of supplies were shifted in 5 days. 20,000 miles of communications wire were strung to maintain communications with units moving in 3 different directions. The 37th Tank Battalion, which would lead the final breakthrough to Bastogne, executed a 15-hour road march through freezing temperatures to reach its attack position. On December 22 at 6 in the morning, 3rd Corps began its attack northward. The fighting was brutal. German forces had anticipated a counter-attack from the south and positioned defences accordingly. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles. The relieving forces had to fight through determined resistance every step of the way. On December 26, 1944, at approximately 4:50 in the afternoon, First Lieutenant Charles Boggess of the 37th Tank Battalion broke through the German lines south of Bastogne. His Sherman tank, named Cobra King, was the first American vehicle to reach the besieged garrison. The siege was broken, though heavy fighting would continue for weeks before the Bulge was fully eliminated. The relief of Bastogne became perhaps the most celebrated achievement of Patton's career. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who commanded the 37th Tank Battalion that spearheaded the breakthrough, would later become Army Chief of Staff and give his name to the M1 Abrams tank. The operation demonstrated everything Patton's admirers claimed for him: the boldness, the speed, the willingness to take risks, the ability to inspire exhausted men to accomplish the seemingly impossible. The German reaction to the Bastogne relief revealed the respect that Patton had earned through combat rather than reputation. Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army that had besieged the town, had positioned defensive forces anticipating exactly the kind of counterattack Patton launched. The Germans knew relief would come from the south. They prepared for it, and they still could not stop it. By December 24, Manteuffel had already concluded that the offensive had failed. He recommended to Hitler's military adjutant that all offensive operations should halt and German forces should withdraw to the West Wall. Hitler refused, but the recommendation itself showed that German commanders understood the implications of Patton's advance. The initiative had shifted. The last German gamble in the West had failed. The Battle of the Bulge cost Germany over 100,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. It destroyed irreplaceable reserves of men, tanks, and fuel that might have prolonged resistance elsewhere, and it established Patton's reputation among German commanders, who had previously paid him little attention. The general they had ignored during the race across France had just broken their final offensive in the West. The war continued for 4 more months, and Patton continued to add to his record. On March 22, 1945, his Third Army crossed the Rhine River at Oppenheim, achieving complete tactical surprise against German defenders who had expected the main crossing further north, where Montgomery was preparing his elaborate Operation Plunder. The assault troops of the 5th Infantry Division's 11th Infantry Regiment paddled across the Rhine in small boats beginning at 10 in the evening, without any preliminary artillery bombardment, despite having 13 artillery battalions standing ready to fire. First Lieutenant Irvin Jacobs led the first assault boat to touch down on the eastern bank. The crossing incurred only 20 casualties because the defenders, a skeleton force of rear echelon troops and convalescent soldiers, were caught completely off guard. General Felber, commanding the German 7th Army in the sector, later admitted the defences at Oppenheim were pathetically meagre. Hitler, in his Berlin bunker, ordered a counterattack against the bridgehead, but was told no reserve forces were available. The crossing came nearly 24 hours before Field Marshal Montgomery's elaborately planned Operation Plunder began on the night of March 23 to 24. Patton, who had competed with Montgomery since Sicily, made sure the world knew. He telephoned General Bradley with undisguised satisfaction. "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we are across," Patton said. "I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts across." The next day, Patton walked onto a pontoon bridge spanning the Rhine, stopped halfway across, and urinated into the river while photographers captured the moment. "I have been looking forward to this for a long time," he declared. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Patton's Third Army had compiled a combat record that supported almost any interpretation. In 281 days of continuous combat from August 1, 1944 to May 9, 1945, his forces had liberated 81,522 square miles of territory across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. They had captured over 1,280,000 enemy prisoners. They had crossed 24 major rivers and liberated over 1,500 cities and towns. Army headquarters described the advance as farther as and faster than any other army in the history of warfare. But Patton himself would not live to write his memoirs or fully shape his legacy. On December 9, 1945, while riding in his staff car near Mannheim, Germany, Patton's 1938 Cadillac limousine collided with an army truck. The impact threw him forward against the partition separating the driver's compartment, breaking his neck. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He lingered for 12 days in the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, his condition slowly deteriorating. He died on December 21, 1945, at the age of 60. The cause of death was pulmonary embolism. He was buried 3 days later on Christmas Eve at the Luxembourg American Cemetery among the men of his Third Army at his own request. His death came before the full flowering of the legend. In the years that followed, biographers, filmmakers, and popular historians would construct an image of Patton as the general the Germans feared most, the commander they watched with dread across the lines, the American who beat them at their own game. The 1970 film Patton, starring George C. Scott, crystallized this image for generations of Americans. The movie opened with Patton delivering a profanity-laced speech to his troops, a composite of several actual addresses that captured his theatrical personality perfectly. Scott portrayed Patton as a warrior born in the wrong century, a man who believed in reincarnation and saw himself as the spiritual heir to ancient conquerors. The film won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and shaped public memory of Patton more powerfully than any biography. The movie's depiction of German respect for Patton drew heavily on the post-war assessments. It showed German generals tracking his movements anxiously, discussing his capabilities with a mixture of fear and professional admiration. This portrayal, while dramatically effective, reflected the legend more than the documented history. The German generals themselves contributed to this legend. In interrogation rooms and later in memoirs and interviews, they offered praise that grew more generous as the years passed. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in the Mediterranean, offered perhaps the most elevated comparison. Patton had developed tank warfare into an art, Kesselring said, and understood how to handle tanks brilliantly in the field. I feel compelled to compare him with Rommel, who likewise had mastered the art of tank warfare. Both had a kind of second sight in regard to this type of warfare. The comparison to Rommel was particularly significant. Erwin Rommel was Germany's most famous field commander, the Desert Fox, whose exploits in North Africa had captured imaginations on both sides of the conflict. To place Patton in Rommel's company was to acknowledge him as a commander of the first rank, a man who belonged in the pantheon of great captains. Other German generals offered their own assessments, each adding to the growing legend. General Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of Operations at German Supreme Headquarters, described Patton as a man of unusual initiative. General Siegfried Westphal spoke of his aggressive spirit. These assessments accumulated in the historical record, creating an image of universal German respect that the wartime records do not fully support. The process by which military legends are created deserves examination. During combat, generals are too busy fighting to philosophize about their opponents. They analyze enemy capabilities for tactical purposes. They study patterns to predict future actions, but they rarely have time to assess genius or artistry. Those judgments come later, in the quiet aftermath of defeat, when survivors seek to understand how they lost. But we should understand what this praise represented. These were defeated men explaining how they had lost. It served their pride to claim they had been beaten by an exceptional opponent rather than by systematic advantages in manpower, material, and logistics. The Americans had more tanks, more trucks, more fuel, more ammunition, and more men than Germany could match. Focusing on Patton's individual brilliance made the defeat seem less about fundamental strategic failure and more about the fortunes of war. The Germans also had reasons beyond pride to flatter their former enemies. By the late 1940s, the Cold War had transformed the strategic landscape. West Germany was becoming a crucial ally against Soviet expansion. The Wehrmacht's surviving generals found themselves advising NATO planners, writing studies for American military historians, and positioning themselves for roles in the new West German army. Speaking well of Patton cost them nothing and earned goodwill from their new partners. None of this means the praise was insincere. Patton genuinely impressed professional German soldiers who recognized his mastery of mobile warfare. But the glowing assessments must be read against their context. The same generals who called Patton the most dangerous American commander had not thought him worth mentioning in their intelligence reports while the war was being fought. The story of what Hitler's generals said about Patton is ultimately a story about how military reputations are constructed. During the war, Patton was one American general among many, fighting a campaign that German commanders followed with varying degrees of attention depending on their own responsibilities. After the war, he became a symbol, a representative figure onto whom both Americans and Germans could project their ideas about martial excellence. The Americans wanted a general who could match the legendary German commanders. The Germans wanted an opponent worthy of their defeat. Patton, with his flamboyance, his aggression, and his undeniable battlefield successes, fit both needs perfectly. This does not diminish his genuine achievements. The relief of Bastogne was a remarkable feat of operational art that demonstrated organizational capability as much as individual brilliance. The staff work that made the 90-degree turn possible, the logistics officers who moved 63,000 tons of supplies in 5 days, the Signal Corps soldiers who strung 20,000 miles of wire, these were the unsung contributors to Patton's success. He inspired them, led them, and took credit for their achievements. That is what generals do, but the achievement belonged to an army, not just its commander. The breakout from Normandy demonstrated aggressive mobile warfare at its finest, showing what American forces could accomplish when unleashed against a weakened enemy. The Rhine crossing showed that surprise and audacity could overcome prepared defenses. These were real accomplishments that deserved recognition. Patton's influence extended beyond his own campaigns. His methods shaped American armored doctrine for decades. His emphasis on speed, flexibility, and aggressive exploitation of success became standard practice. The Army studied his operations at its professional schools. Officers who served under him rose to senior command and passed on the lessons they had learned. The ghost of Patton haunted American military thinking long after his death, but the legend outgrew the man. The Patton of popular imagination, the general the Germans feared above all others, the commander they tracked across maps with growing dread, was largely a post-war creation. The historical Patton was brilliant, difficult, aggressive, and sometimes careless with the lives of his men. He was not the center of German attention during the war. He became central to German explanations of defeat only after defeat had become unavoidable. The comparison to Rommel that Kesselring offered is telling. Like Patton, Rommel was a master of mobile warfare who struggled when forced into static combat. Like Patton, he was more skilled at tactics than strategy. Like Patton, his reputation grew larger in memory than it had been in life. Both men became legends, and legends serve purposes that transcend historical accuracy. Patton died believing his legacy would be judged by his victories. In a sense, he was right. But the judgment came from unexpected quarters, from enemies who had barely noticed him during the fighting and who found in his memory a worthy opponent for their own wounded pride. The American Guderian was as much a German creation as an American one, a figure who served the needs of the defeated as much as the pride of the victors. The lesson extends beyond this single story. Military reputations are constructed after the fact, shaped by the needs of those doing the remembering. The generals who praised Patton so effusively after 1945 were not lying. They genuinely admired what he had accomplished, but they were also explaining their own failures, rehabilitating their own reputations, and positioning themselves for a post-war world in which former enemies had become allies. Patton rests today in the American cemetery at Luxembourg, buried among the soldiers of his Third Army. The simple white crosses and stars of David stretch in rows across the manicured grounds, over 5,000 graves marking the price of victory in the war he had spent his life preparing to fight. Patton chose to be buried here rather than at Arlington National Cemetery or in the family plot in California. He wanted to remain with his men. The cemetery is quiet now, visited by tourists and pilgrims who come to pay respect to the general and to the soldiers who served under him. The grave itself is modest, identical to those around it, except for a small barrier that keeps visitors from trampling the grass. There is something appropriate in that modesty. Patton claimed to despise ceremony, though he staged elaborate ceremonies himself. He said he wanted only to be remembered as a soldier who did his duty. The generals who called him the American Guderian are also gone now, their assessments preserved in interrogation transcripts and interview notes and memoirs written for audiences who wanted to understand how the mighty German war machine had finally been broken. Whether the legend captures the full truth matters less than what it reveals about how we remember our wars and those who fight them. Patton understood the importance of theatre, of gesture, of the image a commander projects. He dressed flamboyantly. He spoke dramatically. He posed for photographers with ivory-handled pistols and polished boots. In the end, even his enemies contributed to the performance. The American Guderian took his place in military history not just because of what he accomplished, but because of what others chose to say about him after the shooting stopped. That too is a kind of victory. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.